In today's lesson, we're going to do about globalization and structural economic change. This is part of the OCR A-level spec 3.B, where we need to know about how globalization and economic change affects places and the kind of opportunities and inequalities that it has on people and places. So I've got a couple of maps here that show these really dark red areas dominating industrial places like Liverpool, on Sheffield here, on the east of Sheffield, and lots of areas of Birmingham here. So this is a pattern that we've seen since the 70s and 80s. These red areas show huge areas of deprivation in certain parts of the UK. And it's largely to do with changes in the economic structure of the UK, which are related to global forces. So if we look from the 70s onwards, we can see a certain types of changes happening to the employment structure. So services increase quite drastically from 50% to nearly 80%, and industry goes down quite rapidly, and agriculture doesn't go down as much but does decline at a very slower rate. I'm really interested in why industry goes down, and particularly the impact that that has had on certain places, not just in the UK but also around the world. So the main reason why industry moved is because of global shift in manufacturing. Essentially, TNCs decided to move their production to places like India, China, Indonesia, Brazil. These are AC countries where manufacturing would have been dominant in the 60s and 50s, but it's essentially cheaper to make it in these places. These are labor-intensive industries, and so it's cheaper to make them products in these parts of the world, and technology has improved enough to enable us to do that. So this is what we call the new international division of labor. It's the idea that the production of products which would have been confined to one country is now spread out spatially across the world on a global scale. This has happened since the 70s. This has deepened since the 70s. And factors like containerization and telecommunications have helped this to occur. You know, containerization means I can transport large products from China to the UK much quicker and easier than I could 50, 60 years ago, and I can have my meetings and communications with people all over the world instantaneously, sharing data through things like mobiles and computers. This means that I can take all the things that cost a lot of money, so the labor intensive side of production, I can take all my factories and I can put them where it is cheaper, so EDCs and LIDCs, whilst keeping the jobs that require heavy high education, things like research and development, and put them and keep them in AC. So this is where the labor process, the production, different bits of production are separated out into different parts of the world. This obviously has had an effect in the UK. This loss of industry has had a severe effect. I've highlighted these areas because these are the areas that were dominated by a range of heavy industries and have experienced the worst effects of deindustrialization. You see the Liverpool, Manchester area, Birmingham, Nottingham, and the kind of East Midlands, Leeds and Yorkshire, Newcastle, but also down in South Wales. And when we talk about heavy industries, we're talking about shipbuilding, coal, manufacturing, steel making. And because these areas had reliance on these industries, they led to huge job losses and unemployment, which were concentrated specifically in these areas. And later on, we're going to talk about how other areas might have bounced back a bit quicker, even though they had high industry. But for the understanding is that these are the areas that are those red areas where deprivation is severe because they relied on a very narrow range of heavy industries which then disappeared to other parts of the world. Some of the effects of that, simply lots of the buildings were left behind, abandoned, so you get lots of derelict brownfield sites. And here's an example of one in Sheffield. It's an abandoned steelworks, often heavily polluted, not enough money to be able to clean them up, and even if you are, they're very expensive. So these derelict land that just gets abandoned in these towns. We also get something called the de-multiplier effect. That so means in these areas, when these jobs go, people have less money because they haven't got jobs, so they haven't got any money. And if they haven't got any money, they can't spend it on services. If they can't spend it on services, the people in those services have to shut down those services, and therefore we get more job losses. This is the de-multiplier effect, which means that areas can fall into huge decline once a major industry leaves. There isn't only bad things that happen. Sheffield here on the left, this is a modern picture, and this is Sheffield here on the right. So deindustrialisation in these areas actually led to better air quality because all the secondary industries disappeared and now has been replaced by tertiary industries. Similarly, all that air pollution has to go somewhere. So while we see London, where the secondary industry has gone down since the 70s and 80s, pollution levels have therefore gone down. Places like Delhi, which have gained all that secondary industry, the air pollution has got worse because the industry is now there. So ACs get better air quality, but EDCs and LDCs get worse air quality. When we look at the kind of ACs, we need to understand that even though lots of people would have suffered in the immediate impact of these job losses, not everyone would have been felt the effects equally. I'm using the example of Phil Monty. This is a film about Sheffield where there was huge steel worker losses in the 70s and 80s. Why have I got a picture of strippers? It's because the film resolves on the fact that these guys lose their jobs and so are forced to do something drastic. And what this is trying to kind of amplify to show is to show that often the kind of people that were left behind were the kind of semi-skilled factory workers who didn't have the jobs, they didn't have the skills to be able to do the kind of jobs that would later on replace it. So they didn't have the kind of front of house skills that could be really useful in retail and call centers. They were used to working with their hands, and so the transition for these people was really, really difficult. But for some other people, it was easier for them to reskill. So in many areas, deindustrialization, when new jobs came in, when new tertiary jobs came in, women often actually were able to reskill and get these jobs faster than some of the men. So even within an area of huge deindustrialization, you get splits between certain groups, and this is a good example based on gender. Obviously, we've talked about the negative effects in ACs. Here, I can see a graph that shows the fastest growing economies in the world, and Vietnam, China, Indonesia, India, they're all huge EDCs. So they all experience industrialization because the secondary industries move there. That means they've got a growth in products to be able to export and a kind of wealth and that comes with that. And that means the standard of living on a national scale will generally increase. However, again, not everyone experiences this equally. So because lots of these secondary jobs go into urban areas, it causes mass migration to those areas. When we get mass migration and we don't have enough kind of infrastructure to be able to support that mass migration, we get lots of social issues. So slums appear, issues of housing and healthcare, unemployment because there's not enough jobs to actually meet the demand. And also within that, we get inequality can sometimes actually build. So the people that do have the jobs, they benefit, but the people that come into the city looking for them and don't actually get them actually have a worse time than if they'd maybe stayed in the countryside. But also we can see this divide between the urban areas which have the wealth going into them and the rural areas where people are abandoning it, and therefore they're going to have a much lower standard of living, and there's an inequality between urban and rural areas.